In the opening weeks of February 2026, a transatlantic phone call between Washington and New Delhi produced what may become one of the most consequential bilateral trade arrangements of the decade. The announcement came not through traditional diplomatic channels, but via social media, a pattern that has become emblematic of contemporary American statecraft. What emerged was a framework that touches not merely on tariff schedules and import quotas, but on energy security, geopolitical alignment, and the evolving architecture of global commerce. To understand the significance of this moment, we must first recognize the unique position India occupies in the international system. With a population exceeding 1.4 billion people, India represents the world's most populous democracy and the fifth largest economy by nominal gross domestic product. Its geographic location places it at the intersection of the Indian Ocean trade routes, linking East Africa, the Middle East, Southeast Asia, and the Asia-Pacific region. This strategic positioning has historically granted India considerable diplomatic flexibility, the ability to maintain relationships across ideological divides and pursue what its foreign policy establishment has long termed strategic autonomy. The core elements of the arrangement, as publicly described, involve multiple interconnected commitments. The United States agreed to reduce reciprocal tariffs on Indian goods from 25% to 18%, effective immediately. In exchange, India committed to progressively eliminating its own tariffs and non-tariff barriers against American products, eventually reaching zero. Beyond these tariff adjustments, India pledged to substantially increase purchases of American goods across several sectors: energy, technology, agriculture, coal, and other products, with the total value of these commitments described as exceeding $500 billion. Perhaps most striking, however, was the commitment regarding energy procurement. India agreed to cease purchasing Russian oil and to instead source petroleum from the United States and potentially Venezuela. This element of the arrangement transcends commercial considerations and enters the realm of high geopolitics, touching on sanctions policy, energy security, and the ongoing conflict in Eastern Europe. To appreciate why this energy commitment matters, we must examine India's relationship with Russian petroleum. Following the escalation of hostilities in Ukraine and the subsequent imposition of Western sanctions on Russian energy exports, India dramatically increased its purchases of Russian crude oil. This increase was driven by straightforward economic logic. Russian oil became available at significant discounts compared to benchmark prices, sometimes trading $15 to $20 below Brent crude. For a developing economy with substantial energy import requirements, these price differentials represented billions of dollars in potential savings. India's energy consumption has grown in tandem with its economic expansion. The country imports approximately 85% of its crude oil requirements, making it the third largest consumer of petroleum globally. Any decision affecting oil procurement therefore reverberates through the entire economy, influencing everything from transportation costs to manufacturing competitiveness to inflation rates. The shift away from discounted Russian crude toward American suppliers, who typically sell at or near market prices, represents a considerable economic concession, one that underscores the strategic value India places on strengthening its relationship with Washington. The mention of Venezuela as a potential alternative supplier adds another layer of complexity. Venezuela possesses some of the world's largest proven oil reserves, yet its petroleum sector has been crippled by years of underinvestment, sanctions, and operational challenges. Any resumption of Venezuelan oil exports to India would require either sanctions relief from Washington or a creative interpretation of existing restrictions. This reference may signal broader diplomatic engagement regarding Venezuela's international reintegration, or it may simply represent an acknowledgement of potential future scenarios. The American side of this arrangement also merits careful examination. The reduction of tariffs from 25% to 18% represents a partial rollback of measures implemented as part of the broader reciprocal tariff policy introduced in the current administration's first weeks. By offering this tariff reduction while securing commitments on Indian barrier reduction and increased purchases of American products, the administration appears to be pursuing a negotiating template. Impose significant tariffs, then offer relief in exchange for concrete commitments that benefit American exporters and align with broader strategic objectives. The constitutional and procedural dimensions of these arrangements have generated considerable discussion within American legal and political circles. The United States Constitution grants Congress the authority to regulate commerce with foreign nations, and major trade agreements have traditionally required legislative approval. However, executive branch authority in trade matters has expanded considerably over the past century, with Congress delegating certain powers to the President through various statutes. The current administration's position appears to rest on existing executive authority to adjust tariffs and negotiate limited trade arrangements without seeking formal congressional approval. Critics argue that comprehensive trade deals of this scope exceed executive authority and require legislative participation. The practical implementation of announced commitments also warrants scrutiny. Trade professionals have noted that formal regulatory notices, specific tariff codes, and implementation timelines must be published through official channels before any changes take effect. The gap between announcement and actualization can sometimes stretch for weeks or months, and details revealed during the implementation phase can substantially modify the practical impact of headline commitments. India's commitment to reduce tariffs and non-tariff barriers to zero represents a particularly ambitious undertaking. Non-tariff barriers encompass a vast range of regulatory measures: licensing requirements, product standards, sanitary and phytosanitary regulations, customs procedures, and technical specifications. These measures frequently serve legitimate public policy objectives, protecting consumer health, ensuring product safety, preventing agricultural pest transmission, but they can also function as disguised protectionism. Disentangling legitimate regulation from protectionist practice requires detailed sector-by-sector negotiation, technical expertise, and sustained administrative effort. The agricultural dimension of this arrangement deserves particular attention. American agricultural exports have long faced barriers in the Indian market, ranging from tariffs on products like almonds and apples to regulatory restrictions on wheat and poultry. India's agricultural sector employs hundreds of millions of people, many of them small-scale farmers with limited capital and technological resources. Opening this market to American agricultural products therefore carries domestic political sensitivities for the Indian government. The technology sector presents different dynamics. India has become a major hub for technology services, software development, and digital innovation. American technology companies have substantial operations in India, both serving the domestic market and leveraging Indian talent for global operations. However, India has also imposed data localization requirements, regulations on digital platforms, and policies designed to support domestic technology champions. Balancing market access for American technology firms with India's own digital sovereignty objectives will require nuanced negotiation. Energy commitments form the most geopolitically charged element of this framework. The decision to replace Russian oil with American and potentially Venezuelan supply cannot be understood purely through an economic lens. It represents a strategic alignment with American foreign policy objectives, particularly regarding the conflict in Eastern Europe. The explicit linkage drawn between oil procurement and ending the war in Ukraine suggests that this trade arrangement is conceived not merely as commercial policy, but as an instrument of broader geopolitical strategy. This raises fundamental questions about the relationship between economic and security policy in the contemporary international system. Can trade commitments effectively alter the calculus of major powers engaged in armed conflict? Does India's shift away from Russian oil meaningfully constrain Russian revenue streams and thereby influence Moscow's strategic options? The answers depend partly on scale and coordination. If India's shift is isolated, Other buyers will likely absorb the Russian crude previously flowing to Indian refineries. If, however, India's decision presages a broader realignment, with other major Asian economies reducing Russian oil purchases, the cumulative effect could indeed tighten the market for Russian exports. From New Delhi's perspective, this energy commitment must be weighed against both economic costs and geopolitical benefits. The immediate economic cost comes from the price differential between discounted Russian oil and market-priced American petroleum. Over time, however, enhanced relations with Washington could yield benefits in other domains: technology transfer, defense cooperation, investment flows, and diplomatic support on issues ranging from regional security to international institutional reform. India faces a complex strategic environment. To its north and west lies an increasingly assertive China, with whom India shares a disputed border that has witnessed deadly clashes in recent years. In this context, deepening ties with the United States offers potential counterbalancing advantages, even if it requires economic concessions and reduced strategic flexibility vis-à-vis Russia. The historical relationship between India and Russia has deep roots. During the Cold War, India maintained cordial relations with Moscow while simultaneously engaging with Western nations, extracting benefits from both superpowers without fully aligning with either. Soviet military equipment became a mainstay of Indian defense capabilities, a pattern that continues today with Russian weapon systems still comprising a significant portion of India's arsenal. The reference to a $500 billion commitment for purchases of American products raises important questions about timeframes, binding obligations, and verification mechanisms. In international trade, purchase commitments can take various forms. Sometimes they represent firm contractual obligations by specific state-owned enterprises or government agencies. Other times, they constitute aspirational targets based on projections of private sector activity. The enforceability and credibility of such commitments depend heavily on their legal structure and implementation mechanisms. This arrangement also unfolds against the backdrop of evolving global trade architecture. The international trading system, built around institutions like the World Trade Organization and principles like most favored nation treatment, has come under increasing strain. Nations have increasingly pursued bilateral and regional arrangements rather than multilateral liberalization. The approach embodied in this US-India framework, reciprocal tariff adjustments negotiated bilaterally outside established multilateral processes, both reflects and reinforces this trend toward bilateral deal-making. For American businesses, the potential opening of the Indian market represents significant opportunity. India's middle class continues expanding, creating demand for consumer goods, technology, and services. However, succeeding in India requires more than tariff reductions. It demands understanding of local consumer preferences, navigation of regulatory complexity, and often partnership with local firms. For Indian businesses, the arrangement presents both opportunities and challenges. Exporters to the American market benefit from reduced tariffs, potentially improving their competitiveness. However, domestic firms competing with American imports may face intensified competition, particularly in sectors where Indian producers have previously enjoyed tariff protection. The broader geopolitical context cannot be ignored. The international system is experiencing significant flux, with established powers confronting rising challenges and regional conflicts testing international norms. In this environment, trade policy has become increasingly securitized, evaluated not merely for economic efficiency, but for its contribution to strategic objectives and national resilience. The US-India relationship exists within this larger context of great power competition, particularly the complex triangular dynamic among Washington, Beijing, and Moscow. As tensions between the United States and China have intensified, Washington has sought to strengthen partnerships with nations capable of counterbalancing Chinese influence. India, given its size, location, and own tensions with China, represents a natural partner in such efforts. Implementation will be the ultimate test. International agreements often look different in practice than in initial announcements. Details emerge during implementation that complicate or modify original commitments. Unforeseen obstacles arise. Domestic political pressures force adjustments. The gap between aspiration and realization can sometimes prove substantial. Several specific implementation challenges loom. The technical work of identifying specific tariff lines, establishing implementation schedules, and codifying commitments in binding legal text will require sustained negotiation. Ensuring that both sides interpret commitments consistently will demand ongoing dialogue and dispute resolution mechanisms. Monitoring compliance and addressing shortfalls will test institutional capacity and political will. We stand at a moment of possibility, shadowed by uncertainty. The announced commitments are substantial, the potential implications far-reaching. But between announcement and realization lies the difficult work of implementation, the unpredictable dynamics of global markets, and the contingencies of political change. Whether this framework endures as a landmark achievement in US-India, relations will depend on choices yet to be made by political leaders, bureaucratic implementers, business executives, and ultimately the two peoples whose prosperity and security hang in the balance.